My rival humiliated me publicly, little did he know the general would salute me in front of him. The air in the strategic briefing room was a peculiar blend of chilled formality and simmering anticipation, a heavy quiet that seemed to hum in the very foundation of the building. A palpable pressure weighed upon the atmosphere, almost vibrating with the unspoken expectations of the assembled senior leadership. Before him sat the formidable panel of generals, their faces etched with the weariness of years spent in command, yet their eyes remained sharp, scrutinizing, missing nothing. General Thorne, a man whose reputation preceded him like a silent, imposing shadow, occupied the central seat, his gaze unwavering, betraying nothing of his thoughts. His presence commanded the room, a quiet gravitational force. Beside him, Theron, his posture rigidly perfect, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips, had just finished dissecting his proposal. Theron's voice, usually so resonant and commanding, had taken on a derisive edge, each word a carefully aimed dart. He had ridiculed his data-driven insights, scoffed at his unconventional tactical models, and dismissed his entire strategy as naive, impractical, and utterly devoid of the grounded realities of warfare. Theron spoke of it as if it were a child's drawing presented at a summit of master architects, an amateur's scrawl in a gallery of masterpieces. The silence that followed Theron's tirade was deafening, amplified by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant, muffled city sounds filtering through the soundproofed walls. His own presentation slides still loomed large on the main screen, a stark contrast to Theron's polished, traditional approach. The proposed tactical deployment, unconventional in its dispersal and reliance on predictive analytics, looked, to the untrained eye, almost chaotic, a spiderweb of disparate units rather than a cohesive front. To Theron, it was an open invitation for scorn, a visible manifestation of everything he deemed wrong with modern strategic thinking. He had reveled in the moment, seizing the opportunity to publicly dismantle Kaelen's reputation, to assert his own supposed intellectual superiority in front of the very men who held the reins of the military. Theron had even managed a dramatic pause, letting his words hang in the air, allowing the full weight of his contempt to settle upon Kaelen like a shroud. A lesser man might have flinched, might have erupted in anger, or wilted under the combined gaze of the room, feeling the heat of their judgment. But Kaelen merely stood, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression placid. His heart beat a steady rhythm, unhurried, untroubled. He felt no surge of indignation, no tremor of fear. Instead, a peculiar calm enveloped him, a quiet amusement almost. It was the calm of a chess player who, having observed his opponent's aggressive, short-sighted move, already saw the inevitable checkmate unfolding several turns later. Theron, in his theatrical display, was nearly accelerating his own downfall. He had no idea of the reality beyond this room, a reality that had already begun to play out. He believed he was delivering Kaelen's professional eulogy, but in truth, he was merely composing the first lines of his own. The journey to this moment, to this precise intersection of arrogance and vindication, had been long, arduous, and often solitary. His mind drifted back to the countless hours, the late nights fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering conviction that there had to be a better way, a more efficient path to achieving strategic objectives. His entry into military strategy had been unconventional from the start, a path less traveled. He hadn't come up through the traditional ranks, nor had he been groomed within the established hierarchies of the officer corps. His background was in advanced statistical modeling and predictive analytics, fields typically relegated to academic research or civilian industries, far removed from the dusty battlefields and strategic war rooms. But he saw patterns where others saw chaos, probabilities where others saw randomness, and logical flows where others saw only the unpredictable churn of conflict. He saw the military as a complex adaptive system, ripe for optimization through data-driven insights. It was a perspective that often put him at odds with the entrenched, often calcified, doctrines of traditional warfare, doctrines that had been forged in generations of conflict and refined through intuition and experience, but rarely through cold, hard numbers. He was Kaelen, a junior strategist at 28, often underestimated, seen as an eccentric anomaly rather than a valuable asset. His quiet demeanor, his preference for data over bluster, and his tendency to speak only when he had something truly substantive to contribute often led others to misinterpret his silence as a lack of confidence or, worse, a lack of conviction. They mistook his thoughtfulness for hesitancy, his methodical approach for timidity. His proposals, invariably supported by reams of meticulously collected data, complex simulations, and predictive models, were almost always met with skepticism, if not outright derision. Too theoretical, too abstract, not grounded in the realities of the battlefield, were common refrains, delivered with a dismissive wave of the hand or a patronizing smile. He endured these dismissals with a quiet resilience, a silent resolve that only hardened with each rejection. His sacrifices were not of the battlefield, but of the mind and spirit. He had foregone social engagements, neglected personal pursuits, and poured every waking hour into perfecting his models, into challenging the very assumptions that underpinned conventional military thinking. His work was his life, its validation his silent pursuit, a deeply personal quest for truth and efficiency. Then there was Theron. 32, a senior officer, his lineage stretching back generations of celebrated military leaders, his family name synonymous with valor and strategic acumen. He embodied everything Kaelen was not: boisterous, self-assured to the point of arrogance, a master of rhetoric and public display. Theron adhered rigidly to established protocols, viewing any deviation as a sign of weakness or, worse, insubordination, a dangerous flirtation with chaos. Their paths had crossed early in Kaelen's career, and their incompatibility had been immediate and stark, like oil and water. Theron saw Kaelen's data-driven approach as an affront to the intuitive, experience-based decision-making he championed. He saw Kaelen's quiet analyses as timidity, his unconventional ideas as dangerous folly, undermining the very foundations of military tradition. Kaelen remembered one of their first encounters, during a departmental review, early in his tenure. He had presented a minor adjustment to a logistical supply chain, demonstrating how a small, counterintuitive change in distribution points, relocating a hub a mere 50 miles south, could reduce transit times by 15% and save significant resources over a fiscal year. Theron, then a rising star, had laughed openly, a loud, booming sound that drew all eyes. "You intend to re-engineer centuries of proven logistics with a few lines of code, Kaelen," he'd scoffed, turning to address the room rather than Kaelen directly, seeking validation from his peers. "The battlefield is not a spreadsheet. It demands courage, instinct, and tradition, not the cold calculations of a data analyst." His words had stung, not because they were true, but because they resonated with the prejudices of many others in the room, reinforcing the old guard mentality. Theron relished these public displays of superiority, often ridiculing those he deemed lesser or too unconventional, solidifying his own position by tearing down others. He had established himself as Kaelen's intellectual antagonist, a constant, sneering counterpoint to Kaelen's quiet innovation. The animosity continued, a slow, simmering undercurrent in the daily life of the strategic command. Theron would often make pointed remarks during group meetings, ostensibly aimed at general concepts but clearly directed at Kaelen's known approaches. Some prefer to bury their heads in numbers, he'd muse loudly, while others prefer to actually lead men and make tough calls. Kaelen would remain silent, observing, his internal models already processing Theron's predictable patterns of behavior. He understood that Theron's bluster was a defense mechanism, a way to shore up a position built on convention rather than true adaptability. Kaelen had learned to navigate the subtle politics, understanding that direct confrontation would only play into Theron's hands. His strength lay in his data, and in the quiet, undeniable truth it revealed. His secret weapon wasn't a hidden gadget or a covert ally in the traditional sense, though many might have wished for such a dramatic reveal. It was the very thing Theron so despised, a tactical proposal rooted in an entirely new philosophy of engagement. He called it Distributed Adaptive Resilience, or DAR. Unlike conventional strategies that focused on concentrated force and linear progression, akin to a battering ram attempting to breach a wall, DAR advocated for highly dispersed, interconnected, and autonomous units capable of dynamically adapting to battlefield changes in real time, leveraging hyperlocal intelligence and decentralized decision-making. It was designed to overwhelm an adversary not with brute force, but with unpredictable fluidity and distributed, multi-axis pressure, like a swarm rather than a single, ponderous beast. It was, in essence, a living, breathing network rather than a rigid formation. The concept had been born from his intensive study of historical military failures, not from a lack of bravery or strategic acumen on the part of past commanders, but from a rigid adherence to predictable patterns, from armies being too slow to adapt, too centralized to react. He had spent nearly 2 years perfecting DAR, living and breathing its complex algorithms, refining every variable. Millions of simulations had been run against every conceivable threat scenario, against every known enemy doctrine, against the most advanced virtual adversaries. The data was unequivocal. DAR consistently outperformed traditional methodologies, particularly against technologically advanced and highly mobile adversaries, demonstrating higher success rates, lower casualty counts, and faster achievement of objectives. But it was radical. It challenged every established norm, every hallowed principle of concentrated power, flying in the face of centuries of military thinking. Most dismissed it as naive, too complex, or simply not how we do things, an affront to the wisdom of their predecessors. Yet, there was one man who saw its potential, who possessed the foresight and the courage to look beyond the conventional. General Thorn. Months ago, in a move that surprised many, Thorn had quietly commissioned a small, highly classified think tank, comprised of a diverse group of strategists, logisticians, and even civilian analysts, to explore radical new defensive strategies against a looming, specific threat profile, an emerging geopolitical challenge that demanded unorthodox solutions. Kaelen had been invited to present his DAR concept, not as a primary contender, but as a fringe idea, perhaps to stimulate discussion, to offer a contrasting viewpoint against more traditional proposals. He had presented his data, his intricate simulations, the predictive models that showed DAR's uncanny effectiveness. Thorn listened, his face unreadable, his eyes piercing through the numbers. He asked questions that revealed a deep understanding of strategic nuances, questions that none of the other generals had ever posed, questions that indicated he saw beyond the surface unconventionality to the underlying mathematical elegance and strategic potential. It was in those sessions that Kaelen felt a flicker of hope, a sense that his work might finally find its audience. The decision had been made in absolute secrecy, a clandestine directive from the highest levels. For a highly sensitive, critical operation, one that was too precarious to risk conventional failure, General Thorn had authorized the covert implementation of a modified version of Kaelen's DAR strategy. Kaelen was not directly involved in its execution on the ground. His role was to provide the refined models, the conceptual framework, and the analytical support. He acted as a silent, unseen architect, his influence felt through the data streams and strategic directives. But he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that his strategy, his secret weapon, was now in play, a silent force shaping the realities of a distant conflict. Its success or failure would not only determine the outcome of a critical mission but would also serve as the ultimate, undeniable proof of his unconventional methodologies. He carried this knowledge like a hidden ember, warming him against the chill of professional skepticism, a quiet fire burning within. It was the silent, unseen foundation upon which the edifice of Theron's inevitable humiliation would be built. In the weeks leading up to the public briefing, as the covert operation unfolded in the distant, undisclosed theater, Theron's arrogance seemed to swell, feeding off the perceived vacuum of Kaelen's silence. He saw Kaelen's quiet dedication not as focused determination, but as a retreat, a sign that he had accepted his intellectual inferiority, that he had no fight left. Theron continued his campaign of subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, slights, each one designed to chip away at Kaelen's standing. Kaelen remembered one instance in the mess hall, the clatter of trays and low hum of conversation providing a backdrop to Theron's posturing. He was reviewing some encrypted data on his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tracked the early, anonymized metrics of Operation Nightingale. Theron approached, a few junior officers trailing him, hanging on his every word, their faces reflecting admiration and a desire to emulate his brash confidence. "Still buried in your numbers, Kaelen?" Theron had boomed, loud enough for others at surrounding tables to hear, drawing curious glances. Some of us prefer to engage with the real world, where strategy is forged in the crucible of experience, not simulated on a screen. He offered a condescending chuckle, and his companions dutifully joined in, a small chorus of sycophants. Kaelen merely offered a small, polite smile, his eyes briefly meeting Theron's before returning to his tablet. "Indeed, Theron," he'd replied, his voice calm, an unruffled surface over deep waters. "And some of us prefer to ensure that experience is informed by the most precise understanding of probabilities." Theron had dismissed him with a dismissive wave of his hand, turning back to his acolytes, no doubt regaling them with tales of his own real-world exploits, fabricating narratives where his instinct always trumped data. He saw Kaelen's calm as a concession, his lack of outward reaction as a sign that he had no counter-argument, no fight left in him. He believed he had won the intellectual skirmish long before the public briefing, that Kaelen had already yielded. This quiet, internal confidence was Kaelen's shield, his impenetrable armor against Theron's barbs. He knew the game was already in motion, its critical phase underway far from the polished floors of headquarters. Each day, he received encrypted, anonymized data feeds, mere fragments, deliberately stripped of context to protect the operation's secrecy, but enough for him to track the unfolding success of the DAR strategy. The reports were cryptic, coded, yet the underlying metrics, enemy disarray, minimal friendly casualties, achieving objectives with unprecedented speed and efficiency, spoke volumes. His models were performing beyond even his most optimistic predictions, the theoretical elegance translating into real-world effectiveness. The data points, like secret breadcrumbs, were leading to an undeniable conclusion: DAR was working flawlessly. Theron, meanwhile, was entirely oblivious, blinded by his own self-importance. He was too consumed by his own narrative, too invested in the traditional paradigm, to even consider the possibility that a naive strategy could be quietly proving its worth on the battlefield. He was preparing for the briefing as a triumphant orator, meticulously crafting his words, ready to deliver a crushing blow to Kaelen's unconventional ideas. He saw the briefing as the ultimate stage for his public validation, an opportunity to definitively cement his position as the premier strategic mind and relegate Kaelen to the obscure periphery, a forgotten footnote in the annals of military thought. He chose to frame the entire discussion around the inherent flaws of untested, theoretical approaches, using Kaelen's past proposals as convenient examples, painting them as dangerous academic exercises. He was meticulously crafting his rhetorical attack, unaware that the very untested, theoretical approach he planned to demolish was already delivering a resounding victory thousands of miles away, securing objectives that conventional methods had deemed impossible or too costly. Kaelen's quietness, his apparent lack of engagement in the pre-briefing hallway discussions, only fueled Theron's conviction that Kaelen was resigned to his fate. He interpreted Kaelen's composure as defeat, a silent admission of failure. But Kaelen was not defeated. He was merely observing, waiting for the precisely calibrated moment when the unassailable truth would be unveiled. The anticipation was not nerve-wracking, but rather a quiet hum of satisfaction, a steady build-up to the inevitable crescendo. The stage was set, the audience was assembled, and the unsuspecting antagonist was about to deliver his most devastating, and ultimately self-destructive, performance. The echo of Theron's condescending final remarks still lingered in the air, a verbal stench filling the room. He had ended with a flourish, asserting that Kaelen's fantastical strategy would be nothing short of a catastrophic liability if ever implemented in a real-world scenario. His gaze, triumphant and scornful, was fixed on Kaelen, daring him to respond, to defend the indefensible. The other generals shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding Kaelen's gaze, others offering a look of pity, a silent acknowledgement of the public ritual playing out before them. They had seen this dynamic play out before, the rising star publicly crushing the outsider, the established order reaffirming its dominance. Then, General Thorne cleared his throat. It was a soft sound, barely audible, yet it cut through the lingering tension like a surgical blade, instantly commanding all attention. All eyes snapped to him, drawn by the sudden shift in the room's energy. His expression remained stoic, unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a barely perceptible straightening of his shoulders, a quiet readiness. He looked first at Theron, his gaze analytical, then his eyes, slow and deliberate, settled on Kaelen. "Officer Theron," General Thorn began, his voice calm, even-toned, yet carrying an unmistakable gravitas that demanded absolute attention, silencing any lingering murmurs. "You have articulated your concerns regarding Officer Kaelen's distributed adaptive resilience concept with considerable zeal." He paused, and Theron puffed out his chest slightly, a flicker of self-congratulation crossing his features, mistaking Thorn's measured tone for agreement. "However," Thorn continued, his voice dropping slightly, the shift almost imperceptible but carrying immense weight, "your assessment, while passionately delivered, lacks a crucial piece of contextual information." A ripple of quiet curiosity went through the room, like a sudden gust of wind. Theron's confident smirk wavered, a hint of confusion clouding his eyes, his carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. He opened his mouth, perhaps to interject, to demand clarification, but Thorn's gaze, now sharp and direct, cut him off, a silent, absolute command. "Officer Kaelen," Thorn stated, turning his full attention to him, his voice now imbued with a subtle, yet profound, shift in tone, one of respect, not questioning, not even curiosity, but a quiet certainty. "You presented the DAR concept to a classified working group approximately 3 months ago, specifically tailored for the Operation Nightingale scenario. Is that correct?" His heart, which had been beating its steady rhythm, now gave a single, almost imperceptible leap within his chest. This was it. The moment of truth. He met Thorn's gaze, his voice clear and steady, devoid of any tremor of nervousness or hint of triumph. "Yes, General," he affirmed. "That is correct." Theron's face was a study in rapidly shifting emotions, confusion, then a flicker of dawning horror, followed by utter disbelief, his eyes widening as the pieces clicked into place. Operation Nightingale was one of the most sensitive, high-stakes clandestine operations currently underway, its details known only to a select few at the highest echelons of command. Theron hadn't been privy to its strategic planning, only its existence, a fact he now realized with a gut-wrenching lurch. "And are you aware, Officer Theron," General Thorn continued, his voice now colder, aimed directly at his rival, each word a hammer blow, that the DAR strategy, as proposed and refined by Officer Kaelen, was indeed implemented as the primary tactical framework for Operation Nightingale? The words landed like thunderclaps in the silent room, echoing with immense, undeniable power. Theron visibly flinched, his face draining of all color, becoming a sickly pale. His rigid posture seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping, his eyes widening in stunned comprehension, a look of abject terror settling upon his features. The other generals gasped, some leaning forward in their seats, others sitting back abruptly as if struck by a physical blow. The revelation was unexpected, monumental, a seismic shift in the strategic landscape of the briefing room. "The initial reports from Operation Nightingale," Thorn stated, his voice now ringing with quiet authority, undeniable conviction, "have been nothing short of extraordinary. Objectives achieved with unprecedented speed, minimal collateral damage, and, most importantly, zero friendly casualties despite facing overwhelming odds and a highly adaptive adversary." He paused, letting the full weight of this success sink in, allowing the numbers to speak for themselves. "This outcome," Thorn declared, looking directly at Theron, his voice laced with an undeniable undercurrent of triumph, a quiet victory in itself, is directly attributable to the unconventional brilliance of Officer Kaelen's distributed adaptive resilience. It redefined the very parameters of success in that theater, proving that innovation can, and must, overcome rigid tradition. The air crackled with the raw energy of shock and realization. The generals, who moments ago had looked at Kaelen with pity or dismissal, now stared with a mixture of awe and dawning respect, their previous judgments crumbling. Their faces, hardened by years of command, showed genuine astonishment, a rare display of raw emotion. General Thorn then did something truly remarkable, a gesture that spoke volumes where words would have fallen short. He slowly rose from his seat, his gaze still fixed on Kaelen, his eyes holding a profound respect. And then, deliberately, with a crisp, precise movement, he brought his hand up to his brow and rendered a full, formal salute. "Officer Kaelen," he said, his voice resonant with sincerity, carrying the weight of command and profound gratitude, "on behalf of this command, and indeed, on behalf of the lives saved and the mission accomplished, I salute your strategic foresight and your unwavering commitment to true innovation." The room was utterly silent, the only sound the faint hum of the lights and the beating of stunned hearts. Theron stood frozen, his mouth agape, his eyes fixed on the general's saluting arm, then darting to Kaelen, his face a mask of abject horror and humiliation, a grotesque tableau of shattered arrogance. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for him. The public stage he had so carefully crafted for Kaelen's downfall had become the very platform for his own spectacular ruin. The salute, a gesture of ultimate respect and acknowledgement, was not for him, the celebrated officer, but for the quiet, unassuming junior strategist he had just publicly ridiculed. Kaelen's own reaction was calm, as it had always been. A quiet nod of acknowledgement to the general, a steady gaze that met the myriad of shocked eyes in the room. No triumph, no smugness, no outward display of satisfaction, just a profound sense of quiet vindication. The truth, in its unassailable form, had finally revealed itself, undeniable and absolute. The aftermath of General Thorn's salute was immediate and devastating, particularly for Theron. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating, before it was broken by a chorus of murmurs, hushed whispers that carried the weight of shock and swift re-evaluation. Theron, who moments ago had stood so tall and confident, seemed to visibly shrink, his imposing frame suddenly appearing small and insignificant. His face, which had been crimson with rage and humiliation, now took on a pallid, almost greenish hue, as if a profound nausea had taken hold. His hands, which he had used so expressively to mock Kaelen's work, now trembled imperceptibly at his sides, betraying his inner turmoil. He looked like a man who had walked into a mirror and found his reflection utterly shattered, his carefully constructed persona irrevocably broken. The other generals, recovering from their initial shock, now turned their gazes from Kaelen to Theron, their expressions shifting from awe to something akin to pitying contempt, a stark reversal of their earlier sentiments. There were no direct accusations, no shouts, but the unspoken judgment in their eyes was palpable, a heavy burden for Theron to bear. He saw one general, known for his stern demeanor and adherence to tradition, shake his head slowly, a clear sign of deep disappointment. Another, who had nodded along with Theron's earlier disparagements, now looked genuinely chagrined, avoiding Theron's eye entirely, as if ashamed of his own complicity. The silent condemnation was far more potent than any spoken rebuke. Theron, in a desperate, almost pathetic attempt to salvage some shred of dignity, stammered, But, General, the reports, they were not released." "How could I?" His voice trailed off, thin and reedy, devoid of its usual authority, a shadow of its former commanding self. He was grasping for an excuse, any excuse, but there was none. General Thorn, his salute completed, merely lowered his hand, his expression now one of cool detachment, his gaze unwavering as it met Theron's desperate plea. "Officer Theron," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, echoing with a quiet authority that brooked no argument, "it is a strategist's duty to remain open to new paradigms, to embrace innovation, and to understand that the battlefield evolves beyond rigid adherence to the past. Your personal disdain for Officer Kaelen's methodology blinded you to its strategic merit, even when the data, had you sought it, would have suggested otherwise." It was a quiet, damning indictment, delivered without malice, but with absolute finality, a definitive closure to Theron's professional aspirations in that room. The briefing concluded shortly after, its original agenda effectively derailed by the stunning revelation. As the generals began to disperse, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Several approached Kaelen, their previous coolness replaced by newfound deference, a palpable respect. "Officer Kaelen," one began, his voice laced with genuine respect, "my apologies. We clearly underestimated your capabilities." Another simply offered a firm handshake, a silent acknowledgement of Kaelen's vindication, a gesture of professional admiration. Kaelen accepted their words and gestures with the same quiet demeanor he had maintained throughout, a slight nod, a polite "thank you, General." There was no need for grand pronouncements or triumphant gestures on his part. The results spoke for themselves, a truth etched in the success of Operation Nightingale.
Theron, meanwhile, remained largely isolated, a pariah in the room he once dominated.
He attempted to approach a few of his colleagues, seeking familiar comfort or perhaps a shred of understanding, but they offered curt acknowledgments before quickly moving away, their discomfort evident. His once unassailable reputation was now in tatters, exposed not by external attack, but by his own hubris and the undeniable success of the very ideas he had so vehemently condemned. Kaelen saw him stand alone for a moment, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lost, before he finally turned and walked out of the room, his usual confident stride replaced by a slow, almost defeated shuffle. His public humiliation was complete, his professional standing irrevocably diminished.
Kaelen observed his retreat with a detached analytical interest.
It was the predictable outcome of his rigid worldview encountering an undeniable truth. His quiet observation was not gloating, but simply an acknowledgement of cause and effect, a data point in a complex system.
Weeks turned into months.
The reverberations of Operation Nightingale and the public revelation of the DAR strategy's success echoed throughout the military establishment, a quiet revolution in strategic thought.
Kaelen's position, once peripheral, transformed dramatically.
He was no longer merely a junior strategist, he was now sought after, his insights valued, his unconventional methods seen not as eccentricities but as leading-edge innovation, the future of warfare. He was given a dedicated research division, a team of brilliant minds eager to explore the frontiers of data-driven warfare, a testament to the power of his vision. His ideas, once dismissed, were now eagerly embraced, serving as the foundation for new strategic doctrines, reshaping how the military thought about engagement and defense. The quiet satisfaction he felt was profound, not born of revenge, but of the knowledge that his dedication, his long hours, and his unwavering belief in the power of objective truth had finally been recognized. His work now had the platform it deserved, the opportunity to truly impact strategic capabilities and, most importantly, save lives. Theron's fate was, as expected, a stark contrast. His career, once on a meteoric trajectory, stalled abruptly. The official word was a reassignment to a less strategically sensitive role, a polite euphemism for a demotion to a bureaucratic backwater, a place where innovation was neither needed nor desired. He was no longer seen as a rising star, but as a cautionary tale, a man whose arrogance had blinded him to vital innovation, costing him his professional standing and his future. He faded from the prominent circles he had once dominated, his name now whispered in hushed tones of regret and professional misconduct, not admiration. The public humiliation at the briefing had been the catalyst, but his own ingrained resistance to change and his inability to learn from new evidence were the true architects of his downfall. Kaelen found a new kind of peace in his work. The internal validation had always been there, the quiet confidence in his data and his models, a personal truth he had held dear. But now, that internal conviction was mirrored by external recognition, a powerful affirmation. He could pursue his research with greater freedom, his theories no longer needing constant, arduous justification, no longer fighting against a tide of skepticism. He had proven that true strength lay not in rigid adherence to the past, but in the courage to challenge assumptions, to embrace data, and to trust in the power of innovation, even when it seemed to defy all conventional wisdom. Life, in its wisdom, often presents such moments, where the loud, the arrogant, and the traditional seek to silence the quiet, the unconventional, and the innovative.
It teaches that true validation does not come from the approval of others, nor from the public dismantling of a rival.
It comes from the unwavering belief in one's own truth, from the meticulous pursuit of excellence, and from the quiet resilience to endure skepticism.
For ultimately, the truth, supported by irrefutable evidence, will always emerge.
And in that emergence, the humble may find their quiet dignity, while the arrogant may finally face the full, unsparing gaze of reality. Never underestimate the power of quiet conviction, for it often holds the blueprint for the very future others are too blind to see. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss similar narratives exploring the quiet triumphs of innovation and resilience.
Have you ever experienced a moment where quiet dedication triumphed over loud arrogance?
Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.